All right, sorry about that. Just a little misclick in the production software. So back to what we were talking about. So we were talking about a example event. So remember, an event is when we generate a primary particle, and that primary particle travels through the world. And once we've finished tracking all the primary once we've finished tracking the primary particle and any secondaries it made whilst traversing the world, then that's what we call one event. So when we were looking at this track here, we had this ionization events occurring here, but we didn't see any additional tracks created, and that was because we set a production threshold of secondary particles to 1.03 centimeters. So an electron would have to have at minimum 2.2 MeV created before that it would be tracked, because depending on how detailed you want information, you can set this production threshold to be higher or lower. And if you don't care about secondary electrons, then you just set a high production value, whereas if you're interested, you'd set a lower value. So in this case here, we had a lower electron production. So I think it was, instead of 1 centimeter, it was like 0.1 millimeters or something on that effect. So in this case, we had these ionization events occurring here. So, in the real world, if we had an ionization occurring, we would have an electron being produced. And in this case, we've got 2 additional tracks created. So you see that I've color coded these 2 ionizations as red and blue. So the blue one's here and the red one's here. So you might be thinking, why is this switched around? So in Geant4, it works on the concept of first in, first out. So, sorry, not first in, first out. It's the last in, first out, if that makes sense. But what's occurring is that every time a particle is created during a track, so we had this primary track here and an ionization occurred. So, and depending on if this ionization, if this electron had high enough energy, this will create an additional track. Then, and in this case, this electron did have enough energy. So when this occurs, the particle will be added on top of the track. So in this case, we'll have one particle being added to the a stack, and then we have another particle, and it's got enough energy as well. So this particle is created first, and it's put at the bottom of the stack. And then when another particle gets created, it gets put on top of the last particle. So the last particle, which is generated from this track, it's the first one to be tracked next. So as you see here, we've got a track ID of 3, and then after it, and a parent ID of 1. So a particle's parent ID, it comes from the track ID that it was created on. So in this case, it was these particles were created from the primary particle of the electron, and they had a track ID of 1 since they were the first track to be produced in the world. So because these particles were created during this track, which had a track ID of 1, their parent ID has a value of 1 to represent that they were created in the track ID 1 of the event. And then their track ID, that comes from when they were created. So in this case, this particle was created before this particle. So that's why it has a track ID too. So it was created here. So it gets a value of 2 since, and not a value of 1, since its parent track had a value of 1, so it takes a value of 2. And because this particle, this track ID 3, it was created after this first ionization here, but it gets tracked after, this particle gets tracked here first, because Geant4 deals with the last particle to be generated is the first particle to be tracked next, because it gets thrown to there's a stack, so every time a particle gets created, it gets thrown on top of the stack, and then the first particle on top of this stack will be tracked next, or first. So the top of the stack will be tracked. And this sort of makes sense. Like, if you think of it, if we were to track this particle first, then it created a particle during the its track, then we might have a weird order of when it was occurring in this output. So if we just do the last one that was done, then it makes life a bit simpler. But regardless of that, if we just look at track ID 3, so if we look at its position, we see minus 1.45 millimeters in X, 354 millimeters in the Y, and 167 millimeters in the Z. So if we go to this blue arrow here and we look at its position that this ionization occurred, we can see that this position of the interaction lines up with the step 0 of this track ID of 3. So this, in fact, where this ionization occurred, and this is where the electron in this track was created. But if you look at the energy here, we've got 279. 279 MeV, whereas the change in the step was 0.00326. So naturally you have a bit of binding energy, so that's where a bit of the energy got lost to there. And see, we're in the world phys here. And then, just like with our primary primary particle track, we've also got all the processes listed that occur, and you see it also has an ionization occurring at the end, and this ionization is the end of this track, and due to the energy being below the production threshold for this simulation, and no electron was created. And similarly, if we look at track ID 2, so this track was, remember, this was created before this track ID 3, but just because how Geant4 processes the tracks in a simulation, and that's why that's like that. So if we again look at its step position in 0, we see it was created at minus 1.17 millimeters, 0.37 Y, and 171 millimeters in the Z. So if we look again here, we see that these positions align, and we look at the energies again. Due to binding energy, this energy will be less than the change in the energy dE of the primary step here. And so this is just an example of an event in Geant4. So remember, in this case, we had these ionizations occurring up down here, but their energies were too low to produce electrons, so that's why we didn't see additional tracks being generated, whereas here we had a smaller energy production threshold, so we actually saw some electrons generated as new tracks and being tracked in the world. And if we wanted to just have a bit of a visual representation of the track, we would have our parent ID, so our primary particle generated here in the red. This would be at step 0 where it's generated. These, if we let these yellow points represent steps or processes, so interaction points. So this would be the primary particle's first step 1, so where it first interacts, and then we have these other interaction points occurring later on. And if a particle, secondary particle or process which would create a secondary particle, so for example, like as we just looked at for ionizing and ionizing event, we would have an electron being created, and if this energy of the electron is high enough, then this particle would be added to the track stack, and then we would then follow this particle's track, and then it could interact and make further tracks if they were above the production threshold that we see in the simulation as well. So if just to recap what like the hierarchy of a Geant4 simulation. So when we're talking about Geant4 simulation, we often talk about these concepts here. So a Geant4 simulation it consists of a run, and a run is then made up of events, and one event is the creation of one primary particle and the tracking of all the primary particle and all any secondaries that it creates, either when they leave the tracking geometry or when they lose all their energy or get absorbed or go through some interaction which results in its ending life. And then events are then made up of tracks, and one track consists of the history or the tracking of one particle, and from tracks are then made up of steps, and steps consist of either where a particle has a physical interaction or a process, or when a geometry boundary occurs. So if we go from the world, like an air world, to a water phantom, then a step will occur, and it doesn't matter if the material is the same or different, then these steps will occur regardless. And so if we would just look at that in terms of running a simulation, after we've got all this verbosity spitting out, we've got this run starting here, then we generate an electron, which was our primary particle, then we tracked it throughout our world, and we saw all the interactions that this particle occurred. We can look at its position, its energy, its change in energy, its the step length, so the size, the length that the particle had between one interaction and another interaction, or one step and another step, and how far this total track has gone. So if we keep following this track, we see it's getting longer and longer as it's traversing, whereas we see these step lengths changing from one another, because these are the distances between one interaction occurring and another. And we see lots of multiple scattering, so multiple scattering for an electron, it won't create other particles, so it will just keep on scattering along. Whereas at the end we saw ionization occurring, but because these ionizations were below the production threshold for the electron, we didn't see additional tracks created, but looking at this other example here, where we had a lower production threshold, we actually saw electrons being produced. And so that's why we saw these other tracks being created and then tracking those other tracks. So remember, this is just the basic hierarchy of a Geant4 simulation.